One man looked at the busiest ports on Earth and saw something nobody else saw. Ships were waiting for days, and thousands of workers carried boxes. And everyone accepted it as the price of global trade. But he refused to believe that this was the best way and had a simple idea that would slash the cost of moving goods, reshape every major port on Earth, and quietly become the foundation of the modern global economy. Today, billions of products travel because of a decision made by one man who dared to ask a simple question. Why are we still moving boxes? Hi everyone, welcome back to Tech Stories, the podcast where we tell the most exciting stories on tech, with a very interesting story of a person who reinvented how global trade works. Hi Didi, how are you doing today? Everything fine on your side?
Hey, I'm doing great. Although now you've made me incredibly curious. You just described a technology that changed the entire world, and somehow it's not full of microchips, AI, lasers, or quantum physics. I love that.
Yeah, it's also something that fascinates me. But Didi, I also have surprises to tell you today.
Oh, you've really got me curious.
Because this week, we ranked on top 3 on the weekly tech podcasts on GoodPod, which is a podcasting platform.
Wait, what? That's huge. Top 3 in the weekly tech charts. That's incredible. Congratulations. And to everyone listening, thank you.
Thank you for listening. Here comes the story. So let's start with a story of a young boy who was born in 1913 in a small town in Maxton in North Carolina. His name is Malcolm McLean.
Down where the tobacco.
Malcolm McLean. That's quite a name. It sounds like someone destined to become a banker or maybe a politician, not someone who's about to stumble onto an idea that will eventually change the world.
Yeah, he's not really a banker or something. He grew up in a place surrounded by tobacco fields, cotton farms on the countryside, on a place where opportunities were really scarce. And his parents, they were farmers. They kind of every day in his life revolved around the weather, around harvest. And as Malcolm grew up, America started also to change. The 20s started to promise prosperity, but for families like his, families which live, like they really live in the countryside, those promises often felt really distant. So they have a very, very simple life, right? And then, almost overnight, everything collapsed. The decade of the Great Depression.
It's hard to imagine today. Businesses failed, banks collapsed, unemployment exploded. And for millions of families, the question wasn't, how do I get ahead? It was, how do I get through this week? So Malcolm wasn't growing up in a world of possibilities. He was growing up in a world where survival came first. And somehow, that's where this remarkable story begins.
Yeah, Malcolm noticed something really curious. He noticed that even during the worst economic crisis, one thing never stopped moving, and that's goods. Of course, people still needed food, factories needed the materials, stores needed their products, and someone always needed to carry these goods from one place to another. And that observation would start to shape the rest of his life. And somewhere around the 1920s, this by then 20-year-old Malcolm bought a second-hand truck. It was a very old, bad-looking truck. And running it required as much as mechanical skill as for driving it. But for Malcolm, that truck represented freedom. And he thought that if he was willing to work harder than everyone else, perhaps he could build something that didn't depend on the next harvest. So you see already how he is starting to think, he wants to go out of this hard life. He wants to find a better future for him and his family. So he started to get into the business of transportation. He would wake up before sunrise, load all the products from the local farms onto his truck and drive hours across North Carolina, going and coming back. He became a trucker. And He had no vacations, no weekends, no guarantee that the next customer would call. He was really relying on that truck for his own survival.
And that's the part I find fascinating. He wasn't looking for a revolutionary invention. He was just trying to make a living. Every day was the same. Load the truck, drive for hours, unload it, turn around, and do it all over again.
While competitors focused on finding more customers, he became obsessed with something totally different. He was obsessed with time. Every minute a truck wasn't moving was money disappearing. And he had a lot of waiting. He was waiting at the warehouse. He was waiting at the railway station to unload all the goods. He was waiting for paperwork, for the workers to help, and for tons of other reasons. It was just the way things were. But Malcolm, he hated it. And at that time, he could not even imagine the far way which his way of thinking would lead him.
Was already riding beside him.
By the end of 1930s, his single truck had become several. So he started to expand his business. By the end of 1930s, he had hundreds of trucks, and what had begun as one young man trying to escape from poverty was becoming one of America's fastest growing trucking companies. To everyone around him, Malcolm McLean looked like a success story. He had beaten the Depression, he built a thriving business, he earned respect from the competitors, and he had achieved what millions of Americans could only dream of. It's the American dream, right? Kind of, you made it. But Malcolm, he was not satisfied. Despite all his success, there was one problem that irritated him every single day. One afternoon, while sitting in the cab of his truck, waiting at the crowded port with nothing to do but watch out the window, he asked himself a question that would eventually change the world. He asked the question, why are we unloading the truck at all?
And that's the moment I love. From the outside, Malcolm had already won. He had built a successful company, made money, and achieved the American dream. But he couldn't stop thinking about one tiny annoyance. He's sitting there, watching workers unload every single crate by hand, only for someone else to load those exact same crates onto a ship. And instead of asking, how can we unload faster? He asks something much more dangerous. Why are we unloading at all?
There are moments in history that announce themselves. You see the first airplane, the first step on the moon, the first iPhone. It's kind of you developing towards a big technology innovation. But then there are these moments that look completely ordinary, was the beginning of a silent revolution. One afternoon in the early 1930s, Malcolm McLean drove one of his trucks to the port in New Jersey. The cargo behind him wasn't unusual. It was just cotton. Just another delivery. He parked his truck near to the dock and he joined a long line of drivers already waiting. And then nothing happened. Hours passed. Simply because that was how cargo was moved, or rather even was barely moved. From his seat behind the steering wheel, Malcolm watched the dock workers begin unloading his truck. They moved everything with their hands. Every crate, every sack, every barrel, every single item had to be lifted individually, one by one, from the truck until the dock. And then, hours later, from the dock onto the ship. It was really an exhausting work. You must imagine hundreds, thousands of workers working on the docks. This was simply another day. Malcolm looked at his watch. An hour has passed, then another hour, and his truck has traveled hundreds of kilometers to get there, and now it wasn't transporting anything. Everyone was waiting. Well, most people accepted the situation as it was. After all, this was how shipping had been worked for centuries. From the days of Roman Empire, from the age of the steamships, cargo had always been loaded piece by piece, and no one really questioned it, because everyone had kind of inherited the same system from their ancestors. It simply becomes the way the things are. But Malcolm, looking out from the window, he could not stop staring. his eyes weren't following the workers, they were following the boxes. Each one was touched again and again and again. The real journey from all his cargo wasn't from North Carolina to New York. The real journey was from one pair of hands to another. And then something happened. He asked, why are we unloading the truck at all? And it's not, you noticed here that it's not a question of how can we unload faster, how can we hire more workers, how we can build bigger cranes. It's just, why are we unloading? What if the cargo never left the truck? What if instead of moving thousands of individual boxes, you moved one giant box? A box that could be lifted from a truck, placed directly on the ship, then onto a train, then back on another truck, without anyone ever touching the cargo inside. There's no unpacking, no rewrapping, no counting, no broken cranes, no waiting for dock workers to carry goods one by one. It's just lift it up, move it, deliver. It sounds obvious today, but in 1930s, it bordered madness. And this is one of the funny things about revolutionary ideas is that they often sound ridiculous at first. After all, the shipping industry had existed for thousands of years. And surely, if moving an entire box was such a brilliant idea, someone would have had that idea first, right? That's the argument you usually get. But Malcolm, he wasn't so sure. He drove away from the harbor that evening, and in his mind, the cargo no longer mattered. His customer no longer mattered. There was only one thought he couldn't shake away. Maybe the problem isn't the ship. Maybe it's everything that happens before.
That's such a subtle shift in thinking. Everyone else was trying to make shipping a little faster. Malcolm was asking whether they were solving the wrong problem altogether. And once that question got into his head, there was no turning back. It became an obsession.
Yeah, it became an obsession. Because for years, the idea stayed in the back of Malcolm's mind. He continued building one of America's largest trucking companies. He had everything. But from the inside, he carried an idea that would require him to risk everything he had. The world isn't changed by people who have ideas. It is changed by people willing to bet everything on their ideas.
Change everything. So I close the safe.
By the early 1950s, Malcolm wasn't just another truck driver anymore. His company had become one of the largest trucking business in the United States. More than 1,700 trucks, thousands of trailers, hundreds of drivers, millions of dollars in revenue. And by every conventional measure, he had made it. He had escaped poverty, he had built an empire, and the American dream had already come true. Yeah, but he had this idea of this shipping container which would allow you to have one steel box with which you could then load from a truck to a train, to a ship, back to a train, back to a truck, without touching the cargo inside. This idea was revolutionary because it could eliminate that labor-intensive piece-by-piece loading. It had the potential to drastically lower shipment costs. But the laws in place by the 1950s didn't allow him to own a shipping company. Back then, America's regulations were designed to prevent transportation monopolies. So if you owned a trucking company, you could not simply buy a shipping line or move freights however you liked. The government wanted trucks, railroads, and ships to compete, not to become a giant system. Ironically, this is the very system that Malcolm wanted to fix. If he wanted to reinvent shipping, he had first to destroy the business that had made him successful. Yeah, imagine that for a moment. You spent 20 years building your life's work. Now someone tells you, if you really believe in your big idea, you have to sell everything.
That's an unbelievable moment in the story. Most entrepreneurs risk everything at the beginning, when they have nothing to lose. Malcolm did the opposite. He risked everything after he'd already become successful. And that's a completely different kind of courage. He wasn't escaping poverty anymore. He was walking away from security. He had to ask himself one brutal question. Do I protect the empire I've built? Or do I destroy it to build something even bigger?
I'm all in now. I'm all in now. I'm all in now.
And then in 1955, he made a decision that many of his friends thought was insane. He sold his trucking company. It was one of the hardest decisions of his life because, the bigger the success, the harder it becomes to abandon it. But with the money of the sale and a mountain of borrowed capital, Malcolm purchased a struggling shipping company called Pan Atlantic Steamship Company. Their ships were old. Its finance weren't impressive, and many people saw a company in decline. But Malcolm, he saw something else. He saw a blank canvas.
I love that phrase. He saw a blank canvas. Everyone else looked at that struggling shipping company and saw old ships, debt, and problems. Malcolm looked at it and thought, perfect. Now I can build exactly what I have in mind.
Yeah, he was betting everything he had on turning that idea possible. And then came the next obstacle. The ships he bought weren't designed for containers, of course. The ports also weren't designed for containers, and the cranes weren't designed for containers, but even the roads weren't designed around standardized steel boxes. Nothing existed at that time. Shipping companies needed to change, port authorities needed to change, truck manufacturers, railroads, governments, insurance company, dock operators. If even one piece of that chain refused, the entire idea could collapse. And there was another problem, that no engineer could solve. It's people. Because for generations, Lons Horman had loaded ship by hand. It was skilled work, hard work, dangerous work. Entire communities depended on the works on the dock. The idea of replacing thousands of individual movements with one giant lift wasn't seen as innovation, it was seen as a threat. And I just ask you, Didi, to imagine the reaction of the labor unions at that time. How they feared the massive job losses. And nobody wanted to be the first, because being first meant carrying all the risk.
Exactly. And that's why this story is so much bigger than a piece of steel. Malcolm wasn't asking people to buy a new product. He was asking an entire industry to change its habits. And that's one of the hardest things you can ever ask people to do. Think about it. Every single group had a reason to say no. The dock workers feared losing their jobs. The port operators feared spending millions on new infrastructure. The shipping companies feared betting on something unproven. Everyone had something to lose. So the question was no longer, is the idea good? It was, who is brave enough to move first?
Yeah. That's why I wanted to tell this story, because this is not the story of the invention of the shipping container, but it's the story of the revolution of shipment, which was started by a simple idea of having a global standard, a standard of how the container should look on the interfaces between the trucks and the load, on the interface between the ships and the load. And that is a so massive shift which started in the 1950s that has just changed the course of history dramatically. I think you can start seeing some parallel, right, to the situation we are today with artificial intelligence, with the invention of the computer, with the invention of automation. And there are these moments in history where society needs to fundamentally reorganize how things are done. And Didi, the funny thing which I find of this kind of story is that once an invention succeeds, everyone says, wow, it's so obvious. And of course, you need to use a container, shipment container, etc. But if you're standing there in the middle of the story, watching it, how it was done for hundreds of years. You're carrying all these boxes or all these pallets one by one out of your truck and loading it into a ship. It doesn't feel obvious to have a container. So transport yourself back in the 1950s and try imagine yourself trying to convince investors. We will need new ships. We will need new ports. We need new cranes, new containers, and new trucks. And it will take several years to do this change. But, probably we will lose money by doing this change. It's something that sounds absurd. It's something that people would call impossible. And yet, Malcolm, he had confidence. No, he didn't have confidence. He even had something stronger than confidence. He had a conviction. But Malcolm wasn't gambling with profits anymore. He was gambling with his reputation. He put all he had in it, his fortune, his legacy, and if he failed, history probably wouldn't remember him. He would simply become another businessman who lost everything chasing an impossible dream. But there was one thing that Malcolm understood that many of his competitors didn't. All of his competitors believed they were in the shipping business. But he believed he was in the movement business. Ships were only part of the journey. The real challenge wasn't crossing the ocean. It was eliminating everything that happened before and after the ocean. And that tiny shift of perspective would change the world.
I think that's the real breakthrough. Malcolm didn't see himself as competing with other shipping companies. He was competing with wasted time. Everyone else was optimizing one part of the journey, the ship. He stepped back and looked at the entire journey from factory to customer. And that's such a powerful lesson. The biggest innovations often happen when someone stops asking, how do I make this part better? And starts asking, why does the whole process look like this? That's why he was willing to risk everything. He wasn't chasing a better ship. He was chasing a better system.
Yeah, right. This is really a powerful lesson. And then on April 26, 1956, after years of planning, millions of dollars in risks, and countless people telling him that it couldn't be done, a converted oil tanker quietly left the port of Newark. On its deck, instead of thousands of wooden crates, sat 58 identical steel containers. The ship was called Ideal X. Its name would become one of the most important footnotes on the history of technology, because that morning, almost no one realized that the age of globalization had just begun.
Peel the tape off a boxing guanjo. My shoes came from Sao Paulo, my phone from Seoul. Rice in the bowl from a farm I'll never see. My name on a label across the sea. Same hands, different skies.
You know, it's funny that I think history rarely announces itself. There were no television cameras lighting the harbor, no politician giving speeches, no newspaper headlines declaring that the world was about to change. There was just another ship leaving the harbor. It was April 26, 1956. The ship wasn't new, it wasn't even designed for that job. It was an oil tanker. And now, after months of modification, its deck looked strangely empty. Instead of that mountains of cargo, there were 58 identical steel boxes, perfectly aligned like giant building blocks. It sailed from Newark to New Jersey, bound for Houston in Texas.
Different price. We build our lives on a borrowed land. Stamped on every box.
And the voyage covered nearly 2,000 kilometers. On paper, it looked completely unremarkable, but in reality, it marked the beginning of a new era. Around the docks, people watched, really curious. Some were laughing, others shook their heads. They thought that ports will never rebuild for those boxes. And they thought about what happens if one of these big boxes get damaged, and who would invest billions in just to move cargo differently. So there's so many critics on this idea. And from outside, the containers looked like empty steel coffins. They were heavy, expensive, impractical, and for thousands of years, ships had been loaded one crate at a time. And who was this truck driver to tell the entire industry they had been doing it wrong? But Malcolm wasn't trying to win an argument. He was running an experiment. He was running an experiment which didn't care about opinions. They cared about results. And the real test wasn't whether the ship could cross the ocean. Ships, of course, they had been doing this for years. The question was, could this strange new system save enough money to justify changing everything? When the Ideal X reached Houston, the answer began to emerge. The containers were lifted directly from the ship onto waiting trucks, without unpacking them, without counting thousands of individual items, without exposing the cargo in the rain, without days of labor, without chaos. And for the first time, cargo remained sealed from the factory to its destination. The box itself had become the package. And then the accountants started to calculate. Well, before containerization, loading a ship could cost nearly $6 per ton. With containers, the cost dropped to around 16 cents. 16 cents! A reduction which is so dramatic that many people thought the numbers had to be wrong. It wasn't an improvement, it was just a different economic reality. Because now you start to imagine inventing a car that uses 1/40th of fuel. It used only 1/40th of your fuel. That kind of leap is what Malcolm had created with his system. And even more astonishing, the savings weren't just financial. Ships, they spent less time sitting in the port. Trucks, drivers spent less time waiting. Factories could predict deliveries, and insurance costs dropped because the cargo was no longer handled dozens of times. Theft declined, damage declined, paperwork became simpler, everything became more predictable. The steel boxes weren't just moving goods, they were removing uncertainty.
And that's the moment the skeptics started to go quiet. Because you can argue with an idea, you can't argue with numbers. This wasn't a 10% improvement or even a 50% improvement. It was an entirely different way of thinking about transportation. And I love what you just said. The biggest innovation wasn't really the container. It was the elimination of uncertainty. 58 steel boxes quietly left a harbor, and without anyone realizing it, they had just made the world a whole lot smaller.
Yeah, amazing, right? Amazing. But here again, you see that success didn't arrive overnight. Many ports, actually, they refused to invest in expensive container cranes. And some shipping companies insisted that traditional methods were good enough, and longshore unions remained deeply skeptical. Customers hesitated, and the first voyage had proven that the idea worked, but it hadn't yet proven that the world was ready to change. You know, revolutions rarely happen all at once. More often they just spread, slowly, port by port, customer by customer, container by container. But then history intervened. During the Vietnam War, the US military faced enormous logistical challenges. Millions of tons of supplies had to cross the Pacific quickly and reliably. Food, medical equipment, vehicles, ammunition. Traditional cargo handling was painfully slow. And suddenly, what had been a risky commercial experiment became a military necessity. The war dramatically accelerated investment in ports, cranes, ships, and standardized containers. And within a few years, ports around the world would begin transforming. Old wooden warehouses disappeared, massive container cranes rose above the harbors, and the new ships were designed around standardized boxes. Everything started to adapt, one by one. Today, more than 90% of the world's trade goods spend at least part of their journey inside a shipping container. From your smartphone to your laptop coffee machine, bicycle, television, clothes. At some point, they almost certainly traveled inside an idea that began with one frustrated truck driver sitting in traffic. When Malcolm McLean stood and was at that dock all those years ago, he thought he was solving a problem for truck drivers, but in fact he wasn't. He was redesigning the architecture of civilization, and it just all based on a steel box. I think the greatest lesson of this story is that the invention that changed the world trade doesn't look the most impressive. When we see a container on a ship, we forget that even the box needed to be invented at some point in history. Although, of course, in every revolution like this container shipment and the shipment revolution, in history, you have the winners, you have also the losers. Imagine if you're a dock worker in New York and suddenly one morning a strange ship arrives. And instead of thousands of crates, it carries only 58 giant steel boxes. A crane lifts an entire truckload of cargo. And in less than 2 minutes, the work that once required dozens of men requires only a few minutes. You don't need an economist to tell you what that means. Because in docks were really a live area. So you have thousands of people working there. You have communities surrounding. You have all people living in the neighborhood area. And all this changed because if they're not the jobs at the docks anymore, the small businesses that depended on the dock workers, they lost their customers. Restaurants, they became empty. Bars closed. Hotels struggled to survive. Communities which were built around the ports, they slowly faded. And in many cities, the old waterfront became abandoned, just because the ships no longer needed people in the same numbers. Yeah, and Malcolm McLean, he understood logistics, but even he couldn't predict all the consequences of his idea. His invention didn't simply move cargo more efficiently, it shifted economic power. Ports adapted quickly and became global giants. And those that hesitated, they declined. And yet, let's ask ourselves one uncomfortable question. Should Malcolm have abandoned his idea? Should he have kept the old system simply because it employed more people? I think you could answer yes, until you remember what the old system looks like. Cargo damage, ship waiting for days, food spoiled, costs remained high, products were more expensive, trade was slower, so entire nations remained economically isolated. The old system had winners, yes, but it had losers too. And we just stopped noticing them because it had existed for centuries. Looking back, it's easy to celebrate Malcolm McLean as a visionary. But I think it's equally important to remember the people who stood on the docks watching their wood disappear. The progress is rarely free. Every leap forward sends ripples through society. Some people ride the wave, others are swept away by it. Perhaps the real lesson isn't the innovation. I think the lesson here is that every breakthrough innovation carries a responsibility, not just to build a future, but to help people cross the bridge between the old world and the new world. When Malcolm McLean died in 2001, there were no monuments celebrating the shipping container, no national holiday, no children learning his name in school. And yet, at this very moment, millions of steel boxes are quietly crossing the oceans, each one carrying not only cargo, but the legacy of one man who looked at an ordinary problem and dared to believe that the world could work differently.
Laughed and said, that's not the way, but every revolution starts that way. Steel boxes, big dreams.
And with this, I leave you here, my dear listener. Thank you for listening. Thank you also, Didi. One more time.
I love that ending because it reminds us that the greatest inventions aren't always the ones with the brightest spotlight. Some of them become so successful that they become invisible. Malcolm McLean didn't just invent a better way to move cargo. He changed the rhythm of the modern world. Thanks for joining us on another episode of Tech Stories. We hope you enjoyed it, and until next time.
Yeah, thanks for joining in today. I see you here again next week with one more insightful story on tech. Until then, take care and bye-bye.
He took the chance, betting everything on circumstance. A tanker changed to carry steel, a gamble that the world would finally feel. 58 boxes on that very first ride. Most folks never knew they'd change the tide. No fireworks lit the evening sky, just a quiet beginning that would redefine. The cranes would rise, the ports would grow, and goods would travel where they never go. Steel boxes, big dreams, crossing every sea, changing how the world would trade forever, silently. One idea, one man who dared to rearrange. Sometimes history doesn't roar, it clicks into place with change, from every port to every shore. Nothing would be the same anymore. Factories woke on distant land, cities grew by unseen hands. Prices fell, the market spread, a billion lives were quietly led by something simple, plain and square. A metal box was everywhere. Some jobs vanished with the tide, old dockyards changed, old ways died. Progress always has its cost, every future leaves something lost. Steel boxes, big dreams, sailing through the blue, connecting every corner of the world. We thought we knew. Not a king, not a crown, not a battle won with might, just an engineer of possibility who saw a better way to fight. When history asks who changed the map, remember the man who closed the gap. No monument of marble high, no legend written in the sky, just every package at your door, every product in every store. The world grew smaller day by day, because Malcolm McLean found a better